The morning of my wedding, I stood in the bridal suite mirror adjusting my grandfather's dog tags beneath my dress when my phone buzzed with a text that shattered everything. "We won't be participating in the ceremony today. This is your choice. Face the consequences alone." No signature needed. I knew it was from my father. 4 years of military service, 2 tours overseas, countless nights I dreamed of this moment when they'd finally see me as their daughter again, instead of the family disappointment. Instead, 2 hours before I was supposed to walk down the aisle, my own parents had just abandoned me at the altar of their own pride. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The rejection shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. Maybe because somewhere deep down, I'd held on to this foolish hope that my wedding day would be different. That somehow, the sight of me in white silk would magically erase the years of cold shoulders and disappointed sighs. That Robert and Linda Martinez would remember they had a daughter who'd served her country with honor, not just a child who defied their carefully laid plans for my life. I'd been checking my phone obsessively since dawn, waiting for some sign they'd changed their minds. David had kissed my forehead at sunrise before heading to his groomsmen preparation, whispering that everything would work out fine. He'd grown up with parents who showed up, who celebrated achievements instead of cataloging failures. He couldn't understand the particular brand of conditional love I'd grown up navigating, where acceptance came with terms and conditions that shifted like sand. The text arrived at 9:47 a.m., 3 hours and 13 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. I'd been sitting in the oversized armchair by the window, watching early guests trickle into the Riverside Country Club's parking lot below. Emma Rodriguez, my maid of honor, was downstairs coordinating with the florists, her organizational skills on full military precision display. She'd learned that level of efficiency from me during our deployment together, back when we were both 22 and convinced we could save the world one mission at a time. I read the message twice, then a third time, each word landing like physical blows. The formal tone, the complete absence of warmth, the way they'd managed to make my wedding about their disappointment rather than my happiness. It was so perfectly them that I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I felt that familiar hollow ache in my chest, the one I'd carried since the day I'd enlisted against their wishes, and watched their love turn conditional. My hands trembled as I set the phone aside and walked to the full-length mirror. The dress was perfect. Exactly what I dreamed of during those long nights in the Afghan desert when sleep wouldn't come. Simple elegance, no excessive beading or drama, just clean lines and a subtle train that whispered rather than announced. My hair was pinned in a classic updo that showcased the diamond earrings David had given me for our engagement, the ones that had belonged to his grandmother. Everything was exactly as I'd planned, except for the 2 empty chairs that would now sit in the front row like accusations. I touched the dog tags again, feeling the familiar weight of my grandfather's service record pressed against my collarbone. Antonio Martinez had served in Vietnam, came home to build a construction business from nothing, and raised my father to believe that success meant suits and boardrooms, not battlefields and brotherhood. Papa Antonio would have understood my choice to serve. He would have been proud. But he died when I was 17, taking his understanding with him and leaving me with parents who saw my military service as a rebellion rather than a calling. The irony wasn't lost on me that on the day I was supposed to join my life to someone else's, I was more alone than I'd ever been. David's family had welcomed me with open arms from the moment he'd brought me home for Thanksgiving 3 years ago. His mother, Patricia Chen, had spent hours teaching me family recipes and sharing stories about David's childhood. His father had walked me through their garden, showing me the vegetables he'd grown, and asking thoughtful questions about my service that showed genuine respect rather than polite obligation. But they couldn't fill the space where my own family should have been. They couldn't erase the years of phone calls that went unanswered, the holidays I'd spent alone on base while my parents vacationed in destinations they never invited me to visit, the promotion ceremonies where I'd scanned empty auditoriums hoping to see familiar faces that never appeared. I'd invited them anyway. Sent beautiful ivory invitations with hand calligraphy addressing, included personal notes about how much their presence would mean to me. My mother had responded with a brief email asking about the dress code and dietary restrictions. My father hadn't responded at all. They'd RSVP'd yes through the wedding website, a cold digital confirmation that I'd clung to like a lifeline. The wedding planner, a efficient woman named Susan Walsh, had asked about the processional order weeks ago. I'd hesitated, then told her my father would walk me down the aisle. She'd made notes on her tablet, asked about music preferences, moved on to the next detail. I'd never admitted to her, or to David, or even to myself that I wasn't completely certain they'd show up. Hope, I'd learned, was sometimes just another word for self-deception. Now, staring at my reflection in that beautiful dress, I realized I'd been preparing for this moment of abandonment for months without admitting it. The dog tags weren't just sentiment, they were armor. The simple dress wasn't just preference, it was practicality for a bride who might have to walk alone. Every choice I'd made had been unconsciously designed around the possibility that the people who'd given me life wouldn't show up to celebrate the life I'd built. The evidence of their absence stretched back months, woven through every interaction like a thread of indifference I'd refused to acknowledge. When I'd called to tell them about the engagement, my mother's response had been a flat congratulations, followed immediately by questions about David's career prospects and family background. Not about whether I loved him, not about how he'd proposed, not about the joy that had been radiating from my voice. Just a clinical assessment of whether this union would improve their social standing or provide them with grandchildren who'd reflect well on the Martinez name. My father had been even more direct in his disapproval. During our last phone conversation 3 months ago, he'd asked point blank why I was rushing into marriage instead of focusing on building a real career. The dismissal in his voice when he'd said real career had cut deeper than any wound I'd sustained overseas. 4 years of exemplary service, including a Bronze Star for Valor during a rescue operation in Kandahar, apparently counted for nothing in Robert Martinez's definition of professional achievement. That conversation had ended with him hanging up after delivering what he clearly considered sage advice. Take some time to think about what you really want from life, Alexandra. Marriage won't fix whatever you're running from. The way he'd said my full name, with that particular tone of paternal authority, had transported me back to childhood moments when I'd disappointed him by choosing soccer over piano lessons or science camp over debutante preparations. The wedding planning process had been a series of small humiliations disguised as family coordination. When I'd asked my mother about her preferences for flowers, she'd responded that she trusted my judgment, which sounded supportive until I realized it was code for she didn't care enough to have an opinion. When I'd suggested we go dress shopping together, she'd cited prior commitments with her book club and gardening society. When I'd tried to involve my father in selecting music for the father-daughter dance, he'd suggested I ask David to handle the musical decisions, since he was apparently the one with opinions about such things. Each deflection had been politely worded and reasonably justified, making it impossible for me to argue without seeming unreasonable myself. They'd perfected the art of emotional unavailability that maintained plausible deniability. They weren't actively refusing to participate. They were simply too busy, too trusting of my judgment, too respectful of my independence to interfere with my choices. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The guest list had provided another painful revelation about where I stood in their priorities. When I'd asked for their list of family friends and business associates they'd like to invite, my mother had provided exactly 12 names. 12 people from their entire social circle whom they deemed worthy of celebrating their daughter's wedding. David's parents had submitted 47 names, including college friends, neighbors, business partners, and extended family members I'd never met, but who'd apparently asked to be included because they'd heard so much about me. The contrast was stark enough that David had noticed and gently asked if there was tension in my family. I deflected with vague explanations about my parents being private people who kept small social circles. The lie had tasted bitter, but the truth felt too pathetic to voice. How could I explain that my own parents found me so fundamentally disappointing that they couldn't summon enthusiasm for my wedding among their friends? The rehearsal dinner had been the final confirmation of their emotional distance. They'd arrived precisely on time, dressed appropriately, and interacted politely with David's family. My mother had complimented Patricia Chen on her dress and made pleasant conversation about the restaurant's atmosphere. My father had shaken hands with David's father and discussed the current state of the construction industry with professional interest. But they'd sat at the far end of the table during dinner, flanked by the 12 friends they'd deemed worthy of invitation. They'd smiled during toasts but hadn't offered any of their own. When David's father had stood to share a story about the first time he'd met me and how he'd immediately known I was perfect for his son, my parents had applauded politely and remained seated. When his mother had tearfully thanked me for bringing such joy into David's life, mine had nodded approvingly and checked her watch. The evening had concluded with traditional embraces and wishes for good weather the following day. My father had patted my shoulder in the same perfunctory way he'd congratulated me on high school graduation. My mother had kissed my cheek and reminded me to get plenty of sleep. Neither had mentioned how proud they were, how beautiful the ceremony would be, or how happy they were to see me marrying someone who clearly adored me. I'd driven home that night with a hollow feeling in my chest that I'd tried to attribute to pre-wedding nerves. David had been unusually quiet during the drive, and when I'd asked if everything was okay, he'd hesitated before saying he thought my parents seemed stressed about something. His kindness, in offering them an excuse for their behavior, had made me love him more and hurt more simultaneously. That morning, I'd woken up with desperate hope that the actual wedding day would be different. That seeing their daughter in a wedding dress would trigger some parental emotion they'd been suppressing. That the magnitude of the moment would overwhelm their disappointment in the choices I'd made. I'd imagined my father's eyes welling up when he saw me in the dress, the way David's father had gotten emotional during our engagement party. I'd pictured my mother fussing with my veil and offering some piece of wisdom about marriage that would bridge the years of distance between us. Instead, I'd received a text message that confirmed what I'd known but refused to believe. Their absence today wasn't about scheduling conflicts or private personalities or high standards for their daughter's choices. It was about their fundamental inability to accept who I'd become, their refusal to celebrate a life that didn't match their blueprint for my success. The worst part wasn't the abandonment itself. It was the familiar ache of having hoped for something different, despite years of evidence that suggested such hope was futile. I'd spent my adult life proving myself worthy of love and respect, through service to my country, through building meaningful relationships, through becoming someone I could be proud of. But none of those achievements mattered to the two people whose approval I'd been chasing since childhood. Standing in that bridal suite, clutching a phone that held their rejection, I felt the full weight of their conditional love. They'd raised me with clear expectations about who I should become, and when I'd chosen a different path, they'd gradually withdrawn their emotional investment. The wedding was simply the final confirmation that I'd never earn my way back into their good graces by being authentically myself. Emma burst through the door 20 minutes later, her arms full of emergency supplies and her face flushed from running up 2 flights of stairs in heels. She took one look at my expression and immediately knew something catastrophic had happened. Without saying a word, she set down her armload of ribbon, bobby pins, and backup lipstick, then pulled me into a fierce hug that smelled like her signature vanilla perfume and the determination she'd carried through every impossible mission we'd faced together. When she finally released me, she held my shoulders and studied my face with the same intensity she'd once used to assess battlefield conditions. Emma Rodriguez had been my squad leader during our second deployment, the kind of soldier who could read danger in the wind and opportunity in chaos. She'd saved my life twice in Afghanistan, and I'd returned the favor once in a market square in Kabul, where civilian casualties had been inevitable until she'd spotted the secondary explosive device that everyone else had missed. "What happened?" she asked, her voice carrying that particular tone of controlled fury that I remembered from situations when someone had threatened her people. Emma had grown up as the oldest of 5 children in a single-parent household in San Antonio, which meant she'd developed fierce protective instincts early and honed them to perfection in the Marines. Anyone who hurt someone she cared about became a tactical problem she was prepared to solve with military precision. I handed her the phone without speaking. She read the message once, her expression darkening with each word, then read it again more slowly. When she looked up, her eyes held the kind of cold anger that had once made insurgents reconsider their life choices. "These people," she said, and her voice was deadly quiet, "are not worthy of being your parents. They don't deserve to breathe the same air as you, much less participate in your wedding day." The finality in her tone was oddly comforting. Emma had never pretended to understand complicated family dynamics because her own family, despite their struggles with poverty and her father's absence, had always shown up for each other. When I'd been awarded the Bronze Star, her entire family had watched the ceremony via video call that her youngest sister had organized. When I'd gotten engaged, her mother had sent me her grandmother's rosary with a note saying I was already family and family took care of each other. But Emma also understood the particular sting of being abandoned by people who should have protected you. Her father had walked out when she was 12, leaving her mother to work 3 jobs while Emma raised her siblings. She'd learned early that some people were incapable of putting anyone else's needs before their own, and she developed zero tolerance for emotional manipulation disguised as parental authority. She began pacing the length of the bridal suite, her strategic mind already working through solutions. "Okay," she said, speaking more to herself than to me, "we need to restructure the processional. I can walk you down the aisle if you want. Or we can ask David's father. He's already offered twice, and I can tell he genuinely wants to do it. Or we can skip the traditional processional entirely and have you enter from the side with the bridal party." Her practical approach to the crisis was exactly what I needed. Emma had a gift for taking seemingly insurmountable problems and breaking them down into manageable tactical challenges. During our deployment, she'd once reorganized an entire supply chain operation in 48 hours after a sandstorm had destroyed 3 months of careful planning. She approached personal disasters with the same methodical competence that had made her an exceptional Marine. But even as she outlined options, I could see her struggling with her own anger at the situation. Emma had sacrificed tremendously for her military service, including a serious relationship with a man she'd loved deeply, who couldn't handle the stress of her deployments. She'd come home to a family that threw her a parade, neighbors who hung welcome home banners, and a community that understood her service as a gift she'd given them. The idea that my own parents couldn't summon basic decency for my wedding day violated her fundamental understanding of how families were supposed to function. The wedding coordinator knocked softly and entered without waiting for permission, a habit that normally irritated me but felt reassuring now. Susan Walsh had been planning weddings for 15 years and possessed the supernatural ability to sense crisis from 3 rooms away. She took in the scene with professional assessment, noting my tear-stained face, Emma's pacing, and the general atmosphere of controlled panic that had settled over the room. "Is there anything I can help with?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. Susan had dealt with every possible wedding disaster, from runaway grooms to sudden family deaths, to weather emergencies that relocated entire ceremonies. She specialized in maintaining calm efficiency while the world collapsed around carefully laid plans, and her presence immediately made the situation feel more manageable. Emma explained the situation in concise military terms, presenting the facts without editorial comment. Susan listened without interruption, her expression revealing nothing beyond professional interest. When Emma finished, Susan nodded once and pulled out her tablet, already accessing backup protocols she'd hopefully never need to use. "We have several excellent options," Susan said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd navigated similar crises before. "The processional can be restructured in multiple ways, and we have time to coordinate whatever feels most comfortable for you. I've worked with families where various circumstances required last-minute changes, and I can assure you that your guests will remember the love and joy of the ceremony, not the specific choreography of who walked where." Her diplomatic phrasing didn't mask the reality of what we were discussing, but it also didn't make me feel like a charity case or a victim of particularly cruel parents. Susan specialized in making extraordinary circumstances feel manageable and dignified, which was exactly the energy I needed as I tried to process this betrayal while maintaining enough composure to get married in less than 3 hours. The 3 of us spent the next 40 minutes reviewing options and making practical decisions about how to restructure a ceremony that had been planned around the assumption that my parents would participate. Susan contacted the photographer to adjust the timeline for family photos, coordinated with the florist about boutonnieres that were no longer needed, and discreetly arranged for the reserved front row seating to be reconfigured without creating obvious empty spaces. Emma called David's parents to explain the situation and ask if his father would be willing to escort me down the aisle. Patricia Chen's response, according to Emma, involved several words in Mandarin that probably weren't appropriate for a church setting. followed by immediate assurance that Robert Chen would be honored to walk me down the aisle, and that they considered me their daughter regardless of my parents' inexplicable behavior. The practical arrangements helped distract me from the emotional devastation, but they couldn't entirely mask the profound sadness of spending my wedding morning restructuring a ceremony around my parents' absence. Every decision we made served as a reminder that the people who'd raised me had chosen their disappointment over my happiness, their principles over their daughter. As Susan finalized the revised processional order, and Emma coordinated with the rest of the bridal party, I found myself staring out the window at guests continuing to arrive for a ceremony my parents had decided wasn't worth attending. Cars pulled up to the country club's circular drive. Families emerged wearing their finest clothes and carrying wrapped gifts, and everyone seemed to understand the basic concept of showing up for people you claim to love. The most painful part wasn't their absence itself, but the casual cruelty of how they'd communicated their decision. A text message. No phone call to explain their reasoning. No conversation about their concerns. No acknowledgement of the pain their choice would cause. Just a cold dismissal delivered via the same medium they'd used to decline a dinner invitation or postpone a business meeting. The decision to proceed without them crystallized slowly, building from resignation into something resembling determination. I'd spent years waiting for Robert and Linda Martinez to see me as someone worthy of their pride, altering my dreams to fit their expectations, and diminishing my achievements to avoid their disapproval. Today was supposed to be different. Today was supposed to be about celebrating the life I'd built and the love I'd found, not about managing their disappointment or earning their conditional approval. Jake Thompson's phone call came at exactly the moment I needed it most, though I couldn't have predicted how perfectly his timing would align with my crisis. Jake had served in my unit during both deployments, a steady presence who'd somehow maintained his sense of humor through situations that had tested everyone's sanity. He'd been the kind of Marine who could diffuse tension with a perfectly timed joke and inspire confidence through his unshakable belief that every problem had a solution if you were willing to work hard enough to find it. Alex, his voice crackled through the phone's speaker. I'm calling because something doesn't feel right about today. I know this sounds paranoid, but I've been getting weird vibes about your wedding situation. Some questions that don't add up. Some information that doesn't match what I know about your family dynamics. Emma and I exchanged glances. Jake's intuition about people and situations had saved our unit more times than anyone could count. He'd developed an almost supernatural ability to read underlying tensions and hidden agendas, skills that had translated seamlessly from military intelligence work to his current position as a private security consultant. When Jake said something didn't feel right, smart people paid attention. What kind of questions? Emma asked, taking the phone and switching it to speaker mode. She'd worked closely with Jake on several operations and trusted his judgment implicitly. During our deployment, Jake had once identified a potential insider threat based on nothing more than inconsistent stories and his gut feeling that someone's loyalty couldn't be trusted. His suspicions had proven accurate when the individual in question was arrested for selling information to hostile forces. People have been asking about your parents, Jake continued, his voice carrying the particular tension that meant he was choosing his words carefully. Specifically about their business connections and their political affiliations. Someone's been digging into their background, asking questions about their financial situation and their social circle. It's subtle, professional-level inquiry, but it's definitely happening. The revelation hit like cold water. My parents' rejection hadn't occurred in a vacuum. It was connected to something larger and more complex than their simple disapproval of my life choices. Someone had been investigating them, asking questions that had apparently made them nervous enough to distance themselves from me and my wedding. The text message suddenly took on a different meaning, less about personal disappointment and more about self-protection. Jake had discovered the pattern while working on background checks for a corporate client. Cross-referencing databases had revealed multiple inquiries into the Martinez family finances, business partnerships, and social connections. The inquiries had been sophisticated enough to suggest government-level resources, but targeted enough to indicate someone with specific interest in my parents' activities rather than random law enforcement phishing. The investigation had apparently intensified over the past 3 months, coinciding perfectly with the period when my parents had become increasingly distant about wedding preparations. Their lack of enthusiasm suddenly made sense as a defensive strategy rather than emotional rejection. They weren't absent because they disapproved of me. They were absent because they were trying to protect themselves from whatever scrutiny my military background might attract to their business dealings. This changes everything, Emma said, her tactical mind immediately recognizing the implications. Your parents aren't just being awful, they're scared. Someone's putting pressure on them, and they've decided that distancing themselves from you is their best protection strategy. It's still a terrible decision, but it's a tactical terrible decision, rather than purely emotional abandonment. The distinction mattered more than I'd expected. Learning that their behavior was motivated by fear rather than shame didn't excuse their choice, but it provided context that made their rejection feel less personal. They hadn't looked at their daughter and found her fundamentally unworthy of their love. They'd looked at their situation and decided that maintaining their social and financial security was more important than supporting me through the most important day of my life. Jake's investigation had revealed connections between my parents and several business entities that had contracted with defense companies during my deployment years. Nothing explicitly illegal, but enough overlap to suggest that someone might suspect them of profiting from insider information or leveraging my military service for business advantages. The timeline matched my deployments perfectly, suggesting that my parents had been building business relationships based on their daughter's access to military operations and intelligence. The realization was devastating in a completely different way than their original rejection had been. They hadn't just failed to support my military service. They'd apparently been exploiting it for financial gain, while maintaining careful distance from me personally. My achievements had been valuable to them as business leverage, but not valuable enough to celebrate publicly when doing so might attract unwanted attention from investigators. Emma's fury was magnificent to witness. She began pacing again, but this time her anger had a focused target rather than general outrage at cruel parents. These people, she said, her voice deadly quiet, used your service record to advance their business interests, while simultaneously treating you like an embarrassment. They profited from your sacrifice while refusing to acknowledge your achievements. That's not just bad parenting, that's exploitation. The military had taught us both to compartmentalize personal emotions when operational necessities demanded focus. But Emma had never developed tolerance for people who used others for personal gain. She'd grown up watching her mother work multiple jobs while her father contributed nothing to the household, and she'd developed permanent contempt for anyone who took advantage of other people's sacrifices for their own benefit. Jake's voice cut through Emma's controlled rage, with additional information that complicated the situation even further. There's something else, he said, his tone suggesting he'd been debating whether to share this detail. The investigation isn't just about your parents' business connections. Someone's been asking specific questions about your deployment record, your commendations, and your current civilian activities. They're building a comprehensive profile that includes your entire family network. The implication was clear. Whatever had triggered the investigation, it centered on me rather than my parents. They were being scrutinized because of their relationship to me, not because of independent suspicions about their business practices. Their decision to distance themselves from my wedding wasn't just about protecting their reputation. It was about protecting themselves from whatever consequences might result from their daughter's military service. This revelation transformed my understanding of the entire situation. My parents hadn't rejected me. They'd been advised or pressured to reject me by someone who viewed our family connection as problematic. Their cruel text message wasn't the product of their disappointment in my choices. It was the product of their terror about what those choices might cost them. The wedding coordinator returned with revised timeline information and additional coordination details, but her presence now felt surreal against the backdrop of Jake's revelations. We were still planning a ceremony while simultaneously uncovering what appeared to be a coordinated effort to isolate me from my family support network. The juxtaposition of wedding preparations and potential conspiracy was disorienting in ways that military training hadn't prepared me to handle. Emma immediately shifted into operational mode, her protective instincts fully activated. We need to identify who's behind the investigation and what they want, she said, already planning our next moves. Jake, can you trace the inquiries back to their source? We need to understand what kind of threat we're dealing with, and whether Alex is in actual danger or just caught up in someone else's paranoia. The possibility that my wedding day was occurring under some form of surveillance or investigation added a layer of complexity that I hadn't anticipated. Every guest suddenly became a potential source of information. Every photographer's camera potentially documented more than just ceremony memories. Every conversation potentially monitored by people with agendas I didn't understand. Jake promised to continue his investigation and report back with whatever additional information he could uncover. Emma began developing security protocols for the ceremony itself, assessing potential vulnerabilities and identifying trustworthy people who could help monitor the situation. And I sat in my wedding dress, processing the reality that my parents' abandonment was connected to forces beyond our family dynamics. The transformation from personal rejection to potential security threat was oddly liberating. I'd spent the morning grieving the loss of my parents' support and questioning my own worthiness of their love. Now I understood that their behavior reflected external pressures rather than my internal failures, which shifted my emotional focus from self-doubt to strategic planning. The ceremony proceeded with military precision, despite the chaos surrounding its preparation. Emma had coordinated with David's groomsmen to create subtle security measures that appeared ceremonial but served protective purposes. Tyler Johnson, David's best man and a former Army Ranger, positioned himself with clear sightlines to potential entry points. Two of David's cousins, both active-duty Navy personnel, took strategic positions among the guests where they could monitor the crowd for unusual behavior or unfamiliar faces. David's father, Robert Chen, had stepped into the role of walking me down the aisle with such grace that most guests would never suspect it hadn't been the original plan. When Susan had quietly explained the situation to him, his immediate response had been to ask what he could do to make the ceremony more meaningful, rather than how to minimize the disruption. He'd spent 20 minutes researching traditional father-daughter wedding customs online, determined to honor every aspect of the role my own father had abandoned. Standing in the country club's foyer, waiting for the processional music to begin, Robert Chen offered me his arm with the solemn dignity the moment deserved. He'd changed into a more formal tie specifically for the honor of escorting me, and his wife Patricia had helped him select a boutonniere that complemented my bouquet. Their attention to details my own parents had dismissed spoke volumes about the fundamental difference between people who showed up and people who found excuses. "You look absolutely radiant," he said quietly, his voice carrying genuine warmth rather than obligatory politeness. "David is the luckiest man in Austin today, and Patricia and I are honored to welcome you officially into our family. You've brought such joy into our son's life, and we couldn't be prouder to call you our daughter." His words filled a space I'd been trying not to acknowledge, the absence of parental pride that should have marked this moment. Robert and Linda Martinez should have been the ones offering final words of wisdom, adjusting my veil, and expressing their happiness about my choice of partner. Instead, that honor fell to people who'd known me for 3 years but understood the significance of showing up for family better than the people who'd raised me. The music swelled as the doors opened to reveal the outdoor pavilion where David waited at the altar, his face illuminating with joy the moment he saw me. The sight of him in his dress blues, standing straight and proud beneath the arch of white roses and greenery, reminded me why this day mattered, despite the morning's revelations and family drama. We were creating something new together, building a life that would be measured by our choices, rather than other people's expectations or fears. The walk down the aisle felt both eternal and instantaneous. Every step carried weight beyond simple ceremony, representing a deliberate choice to move forward despite the people who'd chosen not to support that movement. Guest faces blurred past in a mixture of familiar and unfamiliar features. David's extended family and our mutual friends creating an audience of people who'd chosen to celebrate our love regardless of the complicated circumstances surrounding the day. Emma followed behind me as matron of honor, her presence a reassuring reminder that family could be chosen as well as inherited. She'd positioned herself to provide both emotional support and tactical awareness, her trained eyes scanning the gathered crowd for anything unusual, while maintaining the appropriate ceremonial composure. Her fierce loyalty had transformed from military unit protection to personal dedication, but the intensity remained unchanged. The ceremony itself unfolded with beauty that transcended the morning's crisis. Pastor Michael Hayes, A retired Army chaplain who'd served multiple deployments himself had crafted a service that honored both the joy of the occasion and the reality that some of life's most important moments occurred despite, rather than because, of perfect circumstances. His opening remarks acknowledged that love required courage, particularly the courage to build something meaningful even when not everyone understood or supported that construction. David's vows brought tears to my eyes and audible sniffles from several guests. He spoke about finding someone who understood that service meant sacrifice, who'd made choices based on principle rather than convenience, and who brought strength and purpose to every situation she encountered. His words weren't just romantic promises. They were recognition and validation of exactly the qualities my parents had found disappointing. My own vows had been written and rewritten dozens of times over the past months, but standing there in front of everyone, I found myself speaking from the heart, rather than from my carefully prepared script. I talked about finding someone who saw my military service as something to be proud of, rather than something to be overcome, who understood that real partnership meant supporting each other's dreams, even when those dreams led in unexpected directions. The exchange of rings proceeded without the dramatic interruptions that wedding movies suggested might occur, but I found myself hyper-aware of the guests and their reactions. Jake's revelations had introduced an element of surveillance consciousness that made every camera flash and whispered conversation feel potentially significant. Emma's subtle hand signals confirmed that nothing unusual had been observed, but the underlying tension of being watched remained. Colonel Sarah Williams' arrival during the ceremony created the first disruption to our carefully managed security protocols. She appeared at the back of the seated area just as Pastor Hayes was beginning the final blessing. Her dress uniform immediately recognizable to everyone present with military experience. Sarah had been my commanding officer during both deployments, a leader whose tactical brilliance was matched only by her fierce dedication to the welfare of her personnel. Emma's slight nod indicated she'd been expecting Sarah's presence, though the timing suggested urgency rather than social celebration. Sarah had never been someone who attended personal events unless operational necessity demanded her presence, and her appearance in full uniform indicated this was official business disguised as ceremonial support. The conclusion of the ceremony proceeded with traditional elements, but I noticed David's subtle tension as he became aware of Sarah's presence and its implications. He'd met Sarah during several military social events, and understood that her attendance meant something beyond well wishes for our marriage. His protective instincts kicked in, as he recognized that his new wife might be facing professional complications on what should have been a purely personal day. The receiving line provided Sarah with the opportunity to approach me directly without creating obvious disruption to the wedding festivities. When she reached me, her congratulations were warm but brief, followed by a quiet request to speak privately when I had a moment. Her tone carried the particular authority that indicated this wasn't really a request despite being phrased as one. Emma immediately positioned herself to facilitate the meeting while maintaining wedding appearances. She announced to nearby guests that the photographer needed a few minutes with the bride for solo portraits, creating cover for me to step away from the receiving line without generating questions or concerns. David squeezed my hand reassuringly before I followed Sarah toward a quiet corner of the country club's grounds. Sarah's revelation was simultaneously enlightening and alarming. The investigation Jake had uncovered wasn't random fishing by curious parties. It was a coordinated effort by a defense contractor to identify military personnel whose family connections might create security vulnerabilities. My parents' business dealings had indeed involved contracts with companies that held classified defense contracts, and someone suspected that information sharing had occurred through family channels. The targeting wasn't limited to my family. Sarah explained that multiple military personnel had been subjected to similar family pressure campaigns designed to isolate them from civilian support networks that might be compromised or compromising. The strategy was sophisticated, using financial pressure and social manipulation to create distance between service members and family members whose business interests might conflict with operational security. My parents' sudden rejection now made complete sense as a response to external pressure rather than personal disappointment. They'd been presented with evidence that their business connections were under scrutiny, and advised that maintaining distance from me would demonstrate their lack of involvement in any information-sharing schemes. Their choice to abandon my wedding was tactical self-preservation rather than emotional cruelty. The relief of understanding their motivations was tempered by anger at the manipulation they'd allowed themselves to accept. They'd chosen to protect their business interests, rather than support their daughter during a significant life event, prioritizing financial security over family loyalty. Understanding their reasoning didn't excuse their choice, but it provided context that transformed personal rejection into collateral damage from a larger conflict. Sarah's purpose in attending the ceremony wasn't just to provide information. She'd come to offer protection and support that my parents had been pressured to withdraw. The military took care of its people, particularly when those people were facing harassment or intimidation related to their service record. My wedding day would be protected by people who understood the value of showing up when support was needed most. The conversation with Sarah was interrupted by Jake's urgent approach, his expression indicating new developments that couldn't wait for more private discussion. He traced the investigation back to its source and discovered connections that elevated the situation from harassment to potential national security concern. The defense contractor involved had been under federal investigation for bid manipulation and illegal information gathering, making their interest in military families part of a pattern of criminal behavior rather than legitimate security screening. Emma joined our impromptu strategy session, her protective instincts fully engaged and her tactical mind already developing response plans. The three of them quickly coordinated security measures that would protect the wedding reception, while gathering evidence that could be used to expose and stop the intimidation campaign affecting military families. My wedding was becoming the focal point for a counterintelligence operation, but the operation was designed to protect rather than exploit the celebration. The decision to proceed with the reception, while simultaneously conducting protective surveillance, felt surreal, but oddly appropriate. Military families learned to balance personal celebrations with operational necessities, and my wedding day was becoming a perfect example of that balance. Love and duty weren't competing priorities. They were complementary forces that strengthened each other when properly integrated. David's response to learning about the situation was immediate and unwavering support. His corporate legal background provided useful perspective on the business pressures my parents were facing, but his personal commitment to protecting his new wife took precedence over any professional concerns. He'd married a Marine, and he understood that Marines faced challenges that required team responses rather than individual solutions. The reception began with all the traditional elements of wedding celebration, but underneath the music and laughter, a different kind of coordination was taking place. Jake had positioned himself with clear observation points for monitoring guests and identifying anyone whose presence seemed inconsistent with legitimate celebration. Emma coordinated with David's military family members to create informal security layers that appeared social but served protective functions. Colonel Williams had arranged for additional military personnel to attend the reception as wedding guests, providing both emotional support and professional protection without creating obvious security presence that might alarm civilian guests or tip off anyone conducting surveillance. The additional uniforms in the crowd served dual purposes, honoring military tradition while also demonstrating that I wasn't isolated or vulnerable despite my parents' absence. The moment that defined the entire day came during the traditional father-daughter dance. Robert Chen had graciously offered to fill that role as well, but as the music began, something extraordinary happened instead. Colonel Williams approached the microphone and asked for everyone's attention, her voice carrying the authority that automatically commanded respect from military and civilian guests alike. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "we're gathered here today to celebrate the marriage of two exceptional people, and I'd like to take a moment to honor the service and sacrifice that brought them together. Alex Martinez served our country with distinction and valor, earning decorations that reflect not just personal courage but dedication to protecting others, sometimes at great personal cost." The room quieted as Sarah continued speaking, her words carrying weight that transcended typical wedding toasts. "Today we celebrate not just the union of Alex and David, but the continuation of a legacy of service and commitment that defines the best of American values. Alex's parents chose not to be here today, but her true family, the family forged through shared sacrifice and mutual respect, is here to honor her achievements and celebrate her happiness." As Sarah spoke, uniformed personnel throughout the reception began standing, creating a visual representation of military family that extended far beyond biological connections. The sight of dress blues and army greens rising throughout the crowd was profoundly moving, demonstrating support that transcended individual relationships or personal politics. But the most powerful moment came when Sarah gestured toward the country club's entrance, where a formation of Marines in dress uniform was entering the reception space. They moved with ceremonial precision, but their presence was warm rather than intimidating, celebratory rather than official. At their head walked Master Sergeant Rodriguez, Emma's former commanding officer, carrying a folded American flag and wearing the expression of someone about to deliver a surprise that had been months in the planning. The Marine Honor Guard had come to honor one of their own, providing the parental recognition and ceremonial respect that my biological parents had failed to offer. Their presence wasn't about replacing my parents. It was about demonstrating that service members were never truly alone, that military family extended beyond individual units or deployments to encompass everyone who'd worn the uniform with honor. The ceremony they conducted was brief, but deeply meaningful. They presented me with the flag as a symbol of the nation's gratitude for my service, but more importantly, they offered the validation and recognition that every veteran deserved from their family and community. Their words weren't just ceremonial. They were personal acknowledgement from people who understood the cost of service and the value of sacrifice. David joined me as the Marines completed their presentation, and together we stood surrounded by people who'd chosen to celebrate our love and honor our service. The contrast with my parents' absence was stark, but it wasn't painful anymore. Instead, it was enlightening. Real family showed up, real love manifested through action rather than obligation, and real support came from people who understood your values rather than people who shared your DNA. The investigation that had threatened to overshadow our wedding ultimately became the catalyst for a deeper understanding of what family and loyalty truly meant. My parents' choice to prioritize their business interests over their daughter's happiness had revealed the conditional nature of their love, but it had also created space for unconditional support from people who'd earned the right to be called family through their consistent presence and unwavering loyalty. As the reception continued into the evening, I found myself surrounded by Marines, soldiers, sailors, and their families, who traveled from across the country to attend our wedding. Some I'd served with directly, others were connected through the extended military community, but all of them understood that showing up for important moments was part of the code that governed military families. The dance floor filled with couples celebrating love that had been tested by deployment, separation, and the unique challenges of military life. These were people who understood that marriage required courage, that love demanded commitment even when circumstances made that commitment difficult, and that family was defined by choice and loyalty rather than genetics and geography. My wedding day had begun with devastating rejection from the people who should have supported me most, but it concluded with overwhelming affirmation from people who understood my worth without needing explanation or justification. The Marine Honor Guard's presence had transformed a day marked by abandonment into a celebration of belonging, demonstrating that true family wasn't about who raised you but about who showed up when showing up mattered most. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.